So we have here verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. But the word tribulation was already spoken of earlier in verse 21 and 22. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will again. And if those days, what days? The context of the days in verse 22 is the tribulation days that are great of verse 21. If those days had not been cut short, no life would have been saved. For the sake of the elect, those days, what days? The days that he just spoke about in verse 22, which are the days of the great tribulation in verse 21. Those days will be cut short. By the way, how do I know that he's not cutting short the 3.5 years or cutting short the 7 years itself? Here's how I know. And I say no with a fair amount of assurance, but I know some of you are going to go, Ariel, that's reading into the text. How can I be so sure that the cutting short is not the 3.5 years? Well, Daniel spoke of a 70th week. Daniel spoke of a week, a heptad, a shavua in the Hebrew. Daniel spoke of a 7. Well, then Daniel also spoke of half of the 7 in the middle. And he uses the Hebrew word for middle there, in the middle, at the halfway point of the 7. We take that language, we carry it over into the book of Revelation. We have to jump past all of Discourse here for a moment. We jump all the way into the book of Revelation, and we have the book of Revelation with John. Well, I'm sorry. First, we have Daniel telling us about 1,260 days. Then he tells us about 1,290 days. Then he tells us about 1,335 days. Then when we get to the book of Revelation, and I'll flash this one in post-production. Well, I don't even have to flash it in post. I've got it here now. I can show it to you. In the book of Revelation, 5 times we have this 3.5 years occurring, all in conjunction with what appears to be the last half of the 70th week. The 7 years is broken up into 3.5. Well, this 3.5 is labeled by a few other names: 42 months, 1,260 days, times half a times, and 42 months. All show up in the book of Revelation 5 different times, which is borrowed language from the book of Daniel. So in the middle of Daniel and Revelation, we have Yeshua's Olivet Discourse. So going back over to Matthew, how do I know that he's not cutting short the 3.5 years? Because if he cuts short the 3.5 years, then we no longer have half of a 7. And if we cut short the 7, then we no longer have a 70th week anymore. And then Daniel's prophecies all fall apart, and the book of Revelation makes nonsense also. So if Jesus is saying that the 3.5 years is cut short, then all of those 42 months, 1,260 days, times half a times, they don't follow when it comes to tribulation anymore, or a time frame. If the time frame itself is cut short, then the time frame here mentioned in Revelation is nonsense. Also, it renders Daniel's wording about there being a heptad or a shavua, it renders that nonsense also, because suddenly all the 69 weeks prior were 7s, but this last one suddenly isn't a 7 anymore, right? That is disruptive to the text. The better working model is that what Jesus is talking about being cut short is not the 7, and it's not the 3.5. It's neither one of the 3.5s. We need both 3.5s to equal up to 7. So the 7 stands, and each 3.5 stands. The first half and the last half, they both stand. What gets cut short instead is the Great Tribulation, which conveniently is right here in verse 21. Right? That's why I said go back to the context. If those days, what days? The days spoken of in verse 21. Those days, not any other days. In fact, we don't have to think about any other days. I mean, we could think of maybe it's verse 20. Maybe it's the Sabbath days that are cut short. Maybe it's the winter days that are cut short. Maybe it's the nursing our babies in those days. Maybe those days are cut short. No, these are nonsense considerations, nonsensical choices. We can just stick with verse 21 since the immediate context follows. And then from there, I said all of that to say that in verse 29, when he says, but immediately after the tribulation, now we know that tribulation is actually connected back to verse 21, where he says there will be great tribulation. That's the immediate time when he talked about tribulation. If we know that earlier he already talked about these are only the beginning of birth pangs, right, in verse 8, there's a separation. These are the beginning of birth pains. What are these? It's whatever he just spoke about earlier. these things. Those are the beginnings of birth pangs. What time frame is that? That's the first half of the week. Because he says, starting in verse 9, there's a transition. They'll hand you over to tribulation and kill you. There's a tribulation right there. That tribulation here in verse 9 is connected to verse 15 with the abomination of desolation spoken of Daniel, standing in the holy place. Those of us must be fleeing to the mountains. It's all connected to verse 21. There'll be great tribulation. In verse 22, the cutting short of those days of the tribulation. So this is the better way to read this passage. It's a completely workable model that doesn't require a heavy reading into the text. It's just working from the connected topics in the narrative itself. It doesn't have to it doesn't have to speculate that Jesus is cutting short the 7, thereby rendering Daniel's words useless, or cutting short one of the 3.5, therefore rendering all of those references in the book of Revelation, like he showed you here, as rendered useless as well. So going through all of those, we go back to Dr. Brown's statement about Pretribbers tells us that the Greek verb gather in verse 31 speaks of the gathering of the elect at the end of the tribulation at the time of the parousia of Jesus. And he's disagreeing with the fact that the Pretribbers don't see that this is a rapture because it's talking about the gathering of the elect. And you're thinking, what does this have to do with the tribulation? The Great Tribulation is for Christians, according to both Posttribbers and Prewrathers, but it's the Pretribbers that have a problem with putting Christians into the tribulation. And so that's why I went through this whole exercise of showing you there'll be great tribulation. For who? For the Christians, for the church. And the days will be cut short for the sake of the elect. Who? Who's elect? The Christians, the church, the elect, which does include Israel on some level, but at this point, we're not make a distinction between who is the church and who's Israel. But when we get down to a rapture that happens when? Immediately after the tribulation. Read here as great tribulation. How do we also know that this is great tribulation? There's one more verse I didn't bring in, and I can see by my time that I'm not doing very well. I might not finish Dr. Brown's notes, but this is worth slowing down a little bit on. Another reason why I don't believe that I'm speculating and reading into the text when I say that verse 29 is speaking of the Great Tribulation, even though Jesus doesn't say Great Tribulation, right? There are some Pretribbers are going to say, why couldn't this verse just say immediately after the 7-year tribulation? Or, which by the way, this is really weird the way equivocation messes with your head. If verse 29 means after the 7-year tribulation, then both the Pretribbers and the Posttribbers are in agreement. You're like, what? How can that be? Follow me. The Pretribbers think that verse 29 is speaking of the 7-year tribulation, and therefore the gathering in verse 31 is at the end of the 7 years for Israel's gathering. That's what they think. So therefore, verse 29 is immediately after the 7-year tribulation period. There'll be a gathering for Israel. That's what they said. I mean, look at their chart here. Oops, not that chart. Look at the chart here. Isn't that what it shows? They're showing right here a second coming at the end of the 7-year tribulation, which is verse 31 of Matthew 24, which means when they say immediately after the tribulation of those days, they're talking about immediately after the 7-year tribulation. That's what they think is going on in Matthew 24, verse 29. But strangely enough, if you ask your classic post-tribber, what is verse 29 and when is it happening? Your classic post-tribber is going to say, this is a rapture passage. This gathering in verse 30 is 31. 31 is coming of Son of Man, and verse 30 and 31 coming of Son of Man, and gathering of the elect in verse 30 and 31 respectively. That's a rapture passage. And then if you ask that same classic post-tribber, well, then what is verse 29? What is the event that's immediately after the tribulation? They're going to say, this is the rapture that's immediately after the tribulation. But then you ask them, what tribulation? They're going to say it's the 7-year tribulation. It's also after the Great Tribulation. I don't know if you caught that too. Going back again, this is the power and the confusion of equivocation. Pre-tribulation says the tribulation is 7 years long and the Great Tribulation is 3.5 years long. And the second coming for Israel is after the 7-year tribulation and after the Great Tribulation. It's after both. What do the mid-tribbers say? They say it's after the 3.5-year Great Tribulation, but not after a 7-year tribulation, at least not according to this chart. But look at what post-tribbers do. For all their savvy, Dr. Brown and Pastor Walker are basically saying the same thing about verse 29, that verse 29 is immediately after both the 7-year tribulation, right, for the pre-tribbers. Look at this. It's a 7-year long tribulation, and the second coming and rapture both take place after the 7-year tribulation, but it's also after the, you ready for it? It's after the 3.5-year Great Tribulation, according to classic post-tribbers. Yeah, Dr. Brown, Pastor Walker, you guys are both equivocating on this phrase tribulation and not even realizing it. I'm lovingly picking on you, okay? Don't take my tone wrong. I'm lovingly picking on you. But we pre-wrathers are doing our best to say, look at this, guys. Just check this out for a moment. Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days. Does he say immediately after the 7-year tribulation? He doesn't. Therefore, we don't have to speculate and say that it is. We don't have to assert that it's a 7-year tribulation. But he did talk about a great tribulation, so we can say it is immediately after the great tribulation of those days, which now is no longer 7 years long, nor is it 3.5 years long. It's neither, because both of those are equivocation. Saying it's 7 years long or saying it's 3.5 years long, or not saying either one, is a confusing, equivocal statement. But when Jesus says immediately after the tribulation, the context, there's another passage, and I'll probably close with this, in the book of Revelation, chapter 7. I've gone here before. I'm going to go here again. In Revelation chapter 7, starting in verse 9, there's this great multitude that shows up in heaven. Sequentially, they show up in heaven between the 6th seal and the 7th seal, which according to the pre-wrath model is exactly where they should be according to a pre-wrath rapture. A pre-wrath rapture, which is post-Great Tribulation. They should be right after the 6th seal and just before the 7th seal, and that's exactly where this multitude shows up in heaven, according to our chronology. So it's convenient that I say convenient. It means that it seems like it's confirmation to me. But notice what John and the elders say about these people as to where they came from. You're ready for it? I'm being very pointed. I'm actually a little heated now because equivocation is my enemy too. So for a moment here, John and the elder don't equivocate. So there's this great group, and then starting in verse 13, going down to about verse 15. Then one of the elders responded, saying to me, these are who clothe, saying to me, these who are clothed in the white robes, who are they and where have they come from? John in verse 14 says, I said to him, my Lord, you know. I'm like, dude, I don't know. You know, why don't you tell me? And so he said to me, John records what the elder said. You got to love this. These are the ones who come out of, you ready for it? The 7-year tribulation. He doesn't say that. Nah. He says, these are the ones who come out of the tribulation. Nope. Doesn't say that either. I'm being really, really funny here now for emphasis, right? I'm even being a bit sarcastic. What does the elder say to John? He says, these are the ones who come out of the Great Tribulation. And in the Greek, I can't resist pulling this part up either. In the Greek, in the Interlinear, he says, these are the ones coming out of ektes thlipseos tes megales. Ek out of tes the thlipseos tribulation, tes the again megales great. So he puts an article in front of tribulation and he puts an article in front of great. And the point is there's this emphasis on both of them. We get this specific articulated tribulation, not a tribulation, but the tribulation, and not just any tribulation, but the megale, the great tribulation. So we have something that even Jesus didn't say in Matthew earlier. He said, great tribulation, but he didn't say the great tribulation. But now Jesus giving these words to John and the elder, Jesus giving John the words that John's recording that the elder said. So that's a little confusing, right? Jesus actually gave the revelation to John, but now John's recording what the elder said, but Jesus is the one that told him what the elder said to say to John, right? That gets a little weird in my head. But either way, now Jesus is filling in all of the complete details. And so my point is this. Suddenly we know that these people are coming out of the Great Tribulation, which links it directly back to where Jesus said immediately after the tribulation, but he didn't say after the Great Tribulation. But we know in the book of Revelation that he does say that they come out of the Great Tribulation, which means in hindsight, we now know that verse 29 is immediately after the Great Tribulation. Right? Because there's a gathering in coming in verse 30 and a gathering in verse 31, and that corresponds with this people that show up in heaven in Revelation chapter 7, at least that's the way I see it. If they aren't the ones connected, if these aren't the same people, the people that are gathered here in verse 31, if they're not the same people that John's talking about in Revelation chapter 7, then we have a really big question mark that we have to deal with, a really big mystery. Who is this great multitude that John records that no man could number from every tribe, nation, tongue, and language and whatever? I mean, it's a huge representation, and he can't number them. And they seem to match descriptions given other places in the Bible of the church universal. That's a very interesting fact to look at there. Also, the sequencing matches with the gathering here in Revelation and Matthew chapter 24. And we even have the signs matching up. What does it say in verse 29? Immediately after tribulation of those days, there'll be this sun darkening the moon, not giving us light, and the stars falling from the sky. If you were to go back to Revelation chapter 6, you're going to find that same seal mentioned prior to the Revelation 7 event. So the sequencing still matches. So I don't think it's mere speculation to suggest that the sign in chapter 24, verse 29, leading into the coming of the Son of Man on verse 30 and the gathering of verse 31 is the same events spoken of in Revelation chapter 6 with a sign, and then we see this group showing up in heaven that just got raptured that John is recording. I don't think it's speculation or mere coincidence that there are some overlapping details, namely the sixth seal sign, the sequencing of the tribulation that results in this people that get gathered, raptured, rescued, and then show up in heaven after the sixth seal sign, but before the wrath is poured out in Revelation chapter 8. Right? I don't think it's mere coincidence that that's what's going on. If you take all of the scriptures and put them back together on the table and allow Scripture to speak for itself, I believe that is the best reading of Scripture. And so that's where I'm going to kind of close down my commentary tonight. We didn't finish Dr. Brown. We didn't even finish my reply, but I at least need to do that. In the same way, pre-trib teachers tell us that the Greek verb gather, this is Dr. Brown, in Matthew 24:31 speaks of the gathering of the elect at the end of the tribulation, at the time of the parousia of Jesus. Pretribbers teach that. I disagree with that. Posttribbers believe that the rapture and the gathering, the rapture and the second coming at the end of the age are the same event. I don't agree with that. So what do I have to say here? Dr. Brown here means to imply that pretribbers hold to a gathering at the end of the 7-year so-called tribulation, a gathering they believe is for national Israel instead of for the Christian church. We pre-wrathers hold that Matthew 24:31 is the rapture, which will be followed by the day of the Lord. We do not believe that this verse is describing the second coming at the end of the 7-year period. And again, just going back over to Revelation, to support our view, when we have this group showing up in heaven, I'm closing with this. When we have this group showing up in heaven in Revelation 7, that John and the elder talk about, that came out of the Great Tribulation, which sequentially matches exactly where they should be according to a pre-wrath model, in between the sixth seal and the seventh seal. Then, according to the pre-wrath model, what should happen next should be the opening of the seventh seal, the initiating of the day of the Lord, and the pouring out of the trumpet judgments, and the wrath of God being initiated and being pouring out and on the earth. So let's see if that's what happens, right? Let's see if that follows sequentially. Revelation 7 closes out with describing these people in heaven once again. But when we jump over to chapter 8, what did we start reading? When the Lamb broke the seventh seal. Wow, how convenient. There it is. You hear the sarcasm in my voice again, right? There's the seventh seal, right where we pre-rapture say it should be. There's silence in heaven for about half an hour. I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. And they're told not to hurt the earth until earlier they're told not to hurt the earth until God seals the 144, and then we see the raptured group. But then notice that at this point in time, starting in verse 6, the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound them. And then starting in verse 7, we see some damage being done to the earth. The first one sounds, there's hail, fire mixed with blood, hurled to the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, grass, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. This is judgment from God, but it is in stages, just like he's done in the Old Testament, just like he did with Egypt. He poured out the judgments on Egypt in stages. He kind of got sequentially worse and worse until we got to the plague, the death of firstborn, which was the worst. I mean, Pharaoh could put up with frogs and lice and flies and pestilence and locusts and hail. But when it came to the death of the firstborn, that's when he was grieved. And that's when all of Egypt really kind of broke and said, get out, right? Yeah, I mean, get out of here. Well, if we look at what God has done in the past, he often kind of in phases and stages, it sequentially turns up the heat on people. Even with Israel, he's like, if you guys don't listen to me, I'm going to do this. And if you still don't listen, I'm going to make it worse. And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to make it worse. There's a passage in the Old Testament that I can't remember what it's talking about, but there's this idea that he's going to keep getting worse. He's going to keep increasing the judgments, the persecution, until Israel finally breaks. That's kind of what's going on. I take it. The seven seals themselves are trouble for earth, but they're not the worst. And then the trumpets are bad, but they're not the worst. But then the bowls, they're the worst. They're the bad stuff, the absolute worst of the worst. So he gets excuse me, he gets increasingly worse and worse in the judgments, but the trumpets are still judgments. So in closing, basically what I think we can make a case for is that the pre-wrath model sees that we're still looking at events in Jesus' Olivet Discourse that must be corroborated against the details that he's going to go on later to give to John in the book of Revelation. And that's part of the reason why I'm having this strong disagreement with Dr. Brown. It's not so much that I'm not just focusing on the book of Matthew and Mark and Luke, the Olivet Discourses. I'm disagreeing with Dr. Brown's seemingly omission of bringing in the details from the book of Revelation. And so Dr. Brown is doing his best, just like I'm doing my best. This is an in-house debate. I have no disrespect for Dr. Brown. And so in closing, I just want to let you know that all of my replies here are done in a spirit of love. And absolutely, I could be wrong. Dr. Brown could be right, or me and Dr. Brown could be wrong. Pastor Walker could have it right? The Pretribbers could have it right. Could be a Pretrib rapture. I mean, praise God, right? We won't have to go through anything. I mean, seriously, stop and think about that in my closing statements here. We could be rescued from everything. I mean, that's the best scenario, wouldn't it? I don't want to go through any wrath. I don't want to go through any tribulation. I don't want to see the Antichrist, big, bad, ugly. I don't want to see his face. Yeah, Lord, come take us away now. Yeah. The Lord's going to rescue us one of these days. But wouldn't it be great if he rescued us before any bad stuff happened? Absolutely, that's the scenario I'm praying for. But we need to be ready if that's not the case. And guess what? Historically, the church has had to suffer persecution. So we really do need to get serious about this and be ready either way. All right, I'm going to close here and stop rambling. No meeting next week because of Yom Kippur. By the time you're watching some of the videos, Yom Kippur will be right around the corner anyway. And so no meeting next week, but we will meet the week after next. So let me pull up a calendar and show you what that looks like real quick. No meeting on October the 12th, but we will meet on October the 19th, okay? But that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.